welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. We're so delighted that you joined us on this journey towards greater human flourishing. As always, I'm your host, Michael Stack, an exercise physiologist by training and a health entrepreneur and a health educator by trade. And I'm fascinated by a phenomena called the wellness paradox. This paradox, as I view it, is the trust, interaction, and communication gap that exists between fitness professionals and our medical community. This podcast is all about closing off that gap by disseminating the latest, most evidence-based, and most engaging information in the health sciences. And to do that in episode 120, we're joined by Melissa Merkle. Melissa is a fitness professional and health coach by training. And this conversation is going to continue on a series of conversations we've had on the podcast lately about the role of exercise in dealing with mental health issues. But the thing I particularly like about this conversation is that we're going to have it from the frontline exercise professional's perspective. That's what Melissa is. She's in the trenches every day, working with clients like so many of you. And so many of these people are struggling with mental health issues right now. And that's what this conversation is going to be around. How Melissa approaches mental health issues within her practice as an exercise professional and a coach. And I think you're going to find the through line in this entire conversation is around listening and relationship building. And so I love how this evolves into a discussion that I thought was going to be about maybe nuts and bolts of exercise prescription. And we're going to touch on that really briefly in the conversation. But most of it is a great lesson on relationship building and listening. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page. That's by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 120. Please enjoy this conversation with Melissa Merkle. Well, welcome back to the Wellness Paradox podcast. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Melissa Merkle. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
And we'd be remiss if we didn't shout out Marianne Murphy from the Medical Fitness Association, who once again has been an amazing referrer of guests to the podcast. Melissa, you and I had met previously, but it was Marianne that gave you the recommendation for the podcast. So Marianne, thank you again for being a great source for guests for us.
She is amazing. Yes,
she is. She seems to know everyone. Well, I'm excited to get into this topic. We were actually talking before we got on the air that several of the podcasts lately have been around mental health and exercise, and while that's a good topic that we're talking about, it's kind of also sad at the same time that we're having to talk about it so much. So our conversation is going to be around that today, and we'll get into that in a moment. But before we launch into that, why don't you just give us a little bit of an idea of your background to provide some context for the conversation?
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for having me here. I'm so excited to be a guest and to talk with you today about all of this. I started in the industry over 20 years ago as a group exercise instructor. And at the time I was in college, and that was also around the time that I was struggling with my own mental health issues. So I'm jumping right in. But at that time, I was dealing with some eating disorders, and that turned into depression as well. So it was, again, around that time I got started in this industry, but was also struggling with mental health issues. And since that time, I've worked in the industry, sometimes full-time, sometimes part-time, for the past couple decades. So I've worked in the gym management side of things. I eventually became certified as a personal trainer and a health coach. And I've worked in the bodybuilding sector for a while. And I've worked with seniors and active agers and music. And recently, my focus has really turned back to mental health and well-being, because like you mentioned, we're seeing such a rise in those things. And where I have not only gone through some of it myself to understand how much it impacts your life, it's, I think, really important to talk about exercise and nutrition and some of our lifestyle factors that influence all of these things. And I think until just recently, it wasn't really talked about all that much. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's great that you are bringing on so many guests, and people are more open to hear about these interventions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as I said to you before we got in the air, it really hasn't been intentional. We didn't set out this year with the thought that, hey, we were going to do a bunch of exercise and mental health podcasts, but it is so topical because it's such a challenge. And, I just appreciate you being, open and vulnerable with your own experience. I feel like a lot of what many of us bring to the fitness industry and what we do for people kind of comes from some of our own personal pain. I was an overweight high school student, and for me, that's what got me into fitness. So it's really admirable. What I also like is your diverse background. As I said to you before we came on the air, we've had the Bricks on most recently from the JW Brick Mental Health Foundation to talk about their certification. We've had Dr. Newsom on. She's a researcher in the mental health space. And now you're coming in here as the frontline fitness professional that is working with people on a day-by-day basis with this. So I feel like we're really covering a lot of the different avenues. And you kind of already answered this, but I'm gonna have you go a little bit deeper. This is something that you're obviously very passionate about from your own experience, but you kind of navigated away from this, and you've navigated back to it. What was the drive to kind of come back to maybe your roots, so to speak, and focus on this at this point in your career?
Yeah, that is a great question. So, like you, I was overweight in high school. And really, when I first became a group exercise instructor, it was all about trying to lose weight. And so it was about that. And even though I was going through eating disorder, depression, and all of that, that was not really my drive so much. I mean, looking back on it, eating disorder is, a mental health issue, but my drive was much more physical and like appearance
Sure.
based than really health wise at that point, especially mental health wise. I recognized that when I would work out, I felt better, but it wasn't really the lens that I was looking through when it came to fitness or what I was eating. And so I don't know that it was until a number of years later that I really recognized and started digging into the research around all of the benefits that it has, if that makes sense. It was, for me, a lot more around weight and controlling or managing my weight than it was around mental health, at least for a long time.
Yeah, I feel like that's not uncommon. I think when we're younger, I don't think we have quite as broad of a perspective. It is as we get older. I think that's when our perspective broadens and we start to understand that there's something more than the number on the scale and how you look in the mirror. And it's heartening that there are professionals like yourself that are still in the field, in those stages of life where you actually have developed that level of emotional maturity to realize that. So I'm not sure where the best place to start this discussion is because there's so much to talk about with this. So maybe I'll frame it up like this. You're a frontline fitness professional and coach. I mean, we're working in the trenches every day with people on this. What are you seeing right now? What are you hearing? I know you're really passionate about particularly women and depression and exercise. So kind of frame up, generally speaking, what you're seeing right now and what your observations are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that a lot of the people that I work with in particular, they might be struggling, but they don't necessarily have the voice, or not the voice, but the words to share right away. Like, I think a lot of people, especially women, are struggling in silence,
Mm.
maybe, in that once you start having deep conversations with them, as so many of us do when we're working, especially one-on-one with clients, we start to hear things or notice things that that come up, and it's like, oh, okay, like you are going through some issues. But I think a lot of people, especially when I first start working with them, they don't necessarily classify themselves, or they wouldn't say necessarily they were depressed or struggling mentally. not always something that comes up right away for people. It comes up sometimes later on. So that's one thing that I'm seeing in some people, although I will say that is changing because there is so much more conversation around this. Some of the stigma is starting to lessen. And so people are starting to recognize and feel more comfortable sharing some of those things and not feeling like they're alone. But oftentimes it's not necessarily something that I hear as like the first thing that someone says to me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, right. I feel like there's just a level of rapport and trust that you have to build with someone. So what are your red flags? What do you hear? What do you pick up on that suggests that, hey, maybe something's going on here that's a little more serious that I should be aware of?
That is a really good question. And sometimes there's not necessarily one thing in particular, but having people talk about how they're struggling to find their purpose
Mm,
or fulfillment, those topics have been coming up more frequently.
okay.
Also, some things around eating and stories and some insights as to why people have struggled with their eating. Um, and oftentimes, I guess when we're talking about red flags, when people start talking about some of these things and it brings tears to their eyes, I would say like a physical thing would be just that and being extremely vulnerable, which for a trainer can be an interesting place and an interesting conversation to be in, right? Because we're not trained therapists,
Mhm.
and sometimes, especially as we get closer to our clients, we become more of that role for some people. um, so again, having some very vulnerable conversations with people, um, that is absolutely a red flag, that comes up from time to time. Not all the time, of course, but sometimes it does. And being okay to have some of those conversations with people, not to give them advice, but sometimes to be a listening ear for them.
Yeah, I've got two what I think are really important follow-up questions. That the first one I
Yeah.
just want to start with is what you just said, and then we'll get into the scope of practice, advice, like kind of how you navigate that. But so obviously you lean on your coaching skills here, quite a bit, in these conversations. So kind of, walk us through your mindset or your approach as a coach when some of these things, start to come up and you realize that it could be a really important generative conversation. How do you approach that conversation from a coaching perspective?
Yeah, exactly. So you're right. The whole motivational interviewing
Mhm.
skills, coaching skills is oftentimes what brings about some of these conversations. So a lot of times I find when someone starts to open up in a much deeper way, my role is to listen.
Mhm.
And oftentimes once they get started talking, they have a lot to say because
Mhm.
oftentimes these aren't necessarily things they talk to a lot of people about.
Right.
And so once they get going, again, typically for me, that's when I get fairly quiet and I listen. And and then when there are those pauses, I try to reframe and kind of reiterate what they just said. What I hear you saying is this. Again, to get a better understanding of what that is without judgment,
Mhm.
without trying to fix the problem or say 5 more reps, here we go, right? Because
Right.
at that point, like the whole session is like not even about that. um but yeah, taking that role as a listener
Yeah.
really, I think, is important. And I think that leads us into what then you were going to talk about next with the scope of practice, like what is okay to say and what should you be saying or what shouldn't you be saying. And typically for me, again, It's very conversational, and I I ask if they're talking to anyone else about this. And oftentimes, actually, the conversations I had, and one that I just had recently, my client began with, I know you're not a therapist and I'm working with someone else around this, but here's what's going on. So sometimes they lead with that, which is absolutely fine. But I think if they don't, I feel that it's completely okay to say, have you talked with anyone else about this, and open up the dialogue to working with other mental health facilitators, whether they be therapists or other people that work in the industry. Because in addition to exercise and nutrition, there are a lot of other interventions and treatment opportunities that are now available that I think a lot of people don't even realize are out there. So again, I think just being comfortable enough to have a conversation.
I'd like to take a quick break from today's episode to tell you a little bit more about one of our strategic partners as a podcast. As many of you know, the wellness paradox is all about closing off the trust, interaction, and communication gap between fitness professionals and the medical community. And no organization does that better than the Medical Fitness Association. They are the professional member association for the medical fitness industry. And this is the industry that integrates directly with healthcare in many facilities throughout the entire country. The MFA is your go-to source for all things medical fitness. They provide newsletters, webinars. They even have standards and guidelines for medical fitness facilities. They do events around the entire country. And most importantly, they are one of the more engaging networks in the entire fitness industry. I personally have benefited from the network that I've developed through the Medical Fitness Association. And I highly recommend that all of you that are interested in solving the wellness paradox engage with the MFA. To find out more about the Medical Fitness Association, you can go to their website, medicalfitness.org. That's medicalfitness.org. Now back to today's episode. Yeah, I want to double click on a couple things you said there, because I think it's really important to reiterate them to the audiences. I think most of the time, fitness and exercise professionals, we get into this field because we want to fix things for people. And what you didn't say is, I listen to them for a minute and then I provide them the solutions. It sounds like, you get very curious, very open-minded. You said, not judgmental, which I think, that just kind of lays the groundwork. And then you just shut up and listen, and you don't try to solve their problem, which I think is somewhat counterintuitive for people who are in helping professions like ours. But that's such an important element to that. How hard is it for you, and maybe you've just gotten better at this over time, to just really train yourself to be present and listen, in those conversations, or how do you kind of overcome that barrier of wanting to just kind of barge in?
Yeah, I I understand what you're saying, especially at first,
Yeah.
when I was first a trainer and working with people, right? It's like, well, they're paying me to give them answers.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm not providing like solutions, what am I here for? But what I found, and it has been a work in progress over the years, is that the relationship piece of like working with clients can be just as important as the actual exercise, if not more important. And in order to establish that relationship, you really need to let people talk.
Yeah.
And it's more relationship building than coaching. At least that's what I found. And that's kind of the style that I've shifted into. And of course, everyone has their own style of coaching, but that relationship piece for me is really important. So the listening aspect, I think, while maybe that specific session you're in with someone, maybe you don't get through the actual like exercise routine that you had prescribed, But to have that level of connection with someone is going to ensure that they keep coming back on a more regular, consistent basis because they have that trust with you.
Yeah.
So,
It's the old, no one cares how much you know until they know how much you care kind of thing. And
yeah,
I think that
yes.
that embodies it really, really well. The other thing I want to bring up is that, and I think this is so important because, I've been in the field for, probably around as long as you are. Although if you say you've been in the field for 20 years, I feel like you started when you were 8 years old,
Oh,
just by looking at you on the screen. It looks like I've been in
that's
the field
sweet.
for 20 plus years, that's for sure. But saying that, like, I feel as if we really we always want to provide the answer to people, but and so many people think of us as their therapist, right? I mean, like, anyone who's listening to this podcast who's worked with a client before, invariably we they start to look at us like that. But you're very clear on your scope of practice, and you talk about asking them if they've talked to somebody. How, with that conversation, do you have mental health professionals that you refer out to? Do you just talk in their network? How do you handle that potential referral piece?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I am just actually now starting to build out more of a referral basis
Mm-hmm.
for people. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and so I'm getting very connected in the mental health space in my community. Now, having said that, I work with a lot of people online who
Mm-hmm.
don't live here in Knoxville. And so typically for them, I open up the dialogue, but I don't necessarily have a specific place or person that I recommend them to. Sometimes for clients, I will, after that conversation, start to do some research and some looking, and we'll send them resources after that. But I don't necessarily have something like right there on the spot.
Yeah,
So,
it is the challenge in the age of kind of telehealth and digital coaching that you do get people all across the country, and that also gets into some varying issues around insurance coverages and what goes on in certain states, and so
yeah.
it's complicated, to say the least. So let's talk about where the rubber meets the road. So we've talked about kind of your passion for this, your approach. I think the being curious and just listening and being there and holding that space for somebody is so important. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you're working with your clients. In this particular episode, we're talking about the female clients you're working with, and they're
Mhm.
struggling with these mental health issues. And exercise is hard enough without mental health issues, and then you throw mental health issues into it. So how do you approach this programmatically with these clients? I can imagine if somebody comes to you and they're flourishing and they're in a great state of mental health, it's a very different approach than someone who's struggling with mental health. So what are your considerations that you can pass on to the audience, maybe both from certainly an exercise perspective, but even from a nutritional standpoint that is within our scope as exercise professionals? What are those tools that you can give the audience to work with somebody who may be struggling with mental health issues?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point that someone struggling with depression or other mental health issues, a lot of times they are low energy and having a hard time finding that motivation to do anything.
Right.
And so that is absolutely something to be aware of. And again, I think like we were just talking about that relationship piece, that can be really beneficial to help people come to
Mhm.
you because if you are, that bright light for them, then that helps immensely.
Mhm.
Now, from an exercise prescription standpoint, what the research indicates and what I program for my clients the best that we can, of course, is 3 to 5 days of a higher intensity workout of 30 to 45 minutes. So when I'm planning the workouts, and again, they, as any trainer knows, it doesn't always go how you plan it, but typically I have someone training at least 3 days a week. Again, our goal is to have that moderate to a higher intensity level.
Mhm.
However, some days the energy just might not be there. And so anything is better than nothing.
Sure.
And of course, we take that into consideration. Also, the research indicates that a combination of cardio and strength training works more effectively than either of those on their own. So I will oftentimes do circuit style workouts for my clients that incorporate, again, strength moves and some cardio bursts in there as well, to keep the intensity up, but also to include those different modalities.
How do you manage the waxing and waning of motivation for someone that's dealing with, a mental health issue like depression? I mean, again, like it's hard enough on some days for probably you and I to feel motivated to exercise in a good state of mental health, let alone someone who's not. So how do you think about that? We've all had the client who wants to cancel a session because they say, I'm just not motivated today. And that's certainly a legitimate statement to make. And it's certainly exacerbated by mental health issues. As a coach, how do you approach this, the motivation challenge for somebody who is dealing with a mental health issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll be honest that I don't have a lot of people cancel on me. And not that never happens. Obviously, sometimes it does. Um, but I think that people, and I don't want to sound like full of myself or anything, but I find that people genuinely feel better because I tend to have a positive attitude. Now, I'm not saying your trainer, you have a positive attitude, like that's for sure going to be the thing, because you're right. Like struggling to find that motivation is really hard. Having said that, I think that, again, kind of being that light for people helps immensely with that piece. But I also think too that education around some of this. So when you are working with a client, just sharing some little nuggets like, oh, I read something the other day and like it shows that exercise is more effective in treating depression than medication, or like just having some little nuggets of wisdom or education that you can throw into conversations here and there. I think when they have even just the language around that on days that it is harder to find that motivation, just having that idea like, well, I know that if I exercise, like it's supposed to help me. So I don't feel like doing this, but I'm going to try because it might help. So sometimes that can help too. And sometimes just saying, hey, I understand like you're not feeling it today. What if we just go for a walk around the block together? Or what if we, do something very small, and then oftentimes it can progress from there as well.
Yeah, I think that's great. I want to expand on that in a second. But I think one thing we assuredly know is that it's rare, if ever, that somebody does a workout and it's an appropriate workout and they feel worse after the workout than they did before. So I think, what you said about, letting them know what the research suggests in terms of the mental health benefits of exercise, hopefully that just gets them there. And the likelihood that they're going to leave feeling better than the way they came in is, very, very, very high likelihood. So you said something there that I want to make sure that we touch on. And I think this is always important, but certainly I think when someone's struggling with mental health and enjoyment and fulfillment is something that you want to emphasize. It sounds like, based on what you just said, you really think about kind of client preference to a certain degree in terms of the exercises you do and the things you do. Like, hey, let's just even do a walk today. Would you be open to that? So talk a little bit about how you navigate and almost reconcile like the things that you really want to do with somebody as a trainer with the things you might have to do on a given day just to make it enjoyable for them.
So like how I mold workouts to individual people. Is that what you mean?
How do you individualize it to a person to not only make it effective, but enjoyable? And I realize this is kind of where the art meets the science. So I'm just curious of how you think of that as an exercise professional.
Yeah, well, it goes back to the listening piece. So it's one of those things. I don't think that any trainer gets right away when you're starting to work with a new client, because you have to learn their preferences. But picking up on little phrases they use, or like, this feels strange, or even asking, like, how does that feel for you? Like, what do you think of that? Noticing their body language, not just their form, but what their body language says about certain moves that you're doing with them, and then making adjustments based on that. I take lots of notes after workouts too, so I can remember that the next time I program something in. So again, I think it's just a lot of that, again, communication,
Mhm.
um, and expertise in exercise to know, like, okay, this move or this thing isn't working for them, but we can just swap this in. So I think it's something that just takes a little bit of time when you're working with people to get to that point.
Yeah, I just find it so interesting that even this kind of comes back to listening, right? Listening to what they're saying, listening to their body language. If you give them an exercise to do, and all of a sudden, their head perks up and they smile and they stand up tall, that tells you one thing. And if they kind of slouch and look like they're not too excited, that is part of listening. What is it? The statistic that only 7% of communication is verbal and the rest is nonverbal. So the
Mhm.
ability to listen, I think, is such a underappreciated skill until you've been in the profession a little longer, and then you realize it might be the most valuable skill you have.
Hmm. Right. Because I know when I first started out, I would listen, but not like I do now. Because again, it was like, well, I'm the professional. I'm supposed to be the one that has all of the answers.
Mhm.
And if I ask too many questions, it's going to seem like I don't know what I'm doing,
Yeah.
type of a thing. At least that's, what I thought. And I think that a lot of new trainers struggle or deal with that as well, like finding that comfort level in your own expertise and abilities, and being okay with asking the questions. But I've found recently, and even with clients that I've worked with for years and years and years, I will still ask them on a regular basis, like, how is this feeling like
Yeah.
in your body today? Like, are you noticing things in this space or that space? But the communication is a huge piece of my programming.
Yeah, there's a big difference between listening to understand and listening to respond. And I feel like as you become a more effective coach and connect with people better, it is listening to understand. And so I think those are really important lessons. So it's interesting. I think kind of as we're having this conversation, this yes, is about nuts and bolts of exercise, because as you said, the research is very clear that aerobic and resistance exercise, moderate to high intensity, for the most part, is a great way to address mental health issues with exercise. But it all comes back to the psychology, the listening, the relationship. And so I think that's an important take home. Melissa, where can people go to find out more about you and the great work you're doing?
Yeah, so I am active on Facebook and LinkedIn, and my website as well is melissamerkle.com. And those are the places I hang out the most.
Well, we will link up to all three of those on the show notes page. We'll also make sure we link back to the Brick episode podcast, because from that episode on their show notes page, we have the Move Your Mental Health report that the Brick Foundation
Yes.
published, which I'm sure is a resource you've accessed before. It's, in my mind, it's one of the most comprehensive resources on movement and mental health. So that can kind of provide a bit of a backstop from an evidence-based perspective to our conversation.
Yes, that report has so much great information, and I pull it up regularly and look at it, and it it's so valuable, and the work they are doing is incredible. And so I am very grateful for them and the organization for everything they're providing for all of us.
Yeah, yeah, likewise. Well, Melissa, before I let you go, I'm going to ask you the final question I always end the podcast on, and we've been talking about this today to a certain extent with collaboration with mental health professionals, but I consider the wellness paradox the trust, interaction, and communication gap that exists between fitness professionals and the medical community. From somebody who's a fitness professional, that it sounds like you are bridging this gap. What would be your one piece of advice that you'd give to the fitness professionals that are listening to close off that gap?
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to what we've been talking about. is relationship building. So not just with your clients, but building relationships with the healthcare providers in your community. And again, engaging in those conversations and letting them know what you're doing and what the research says. I found that a lot of them are really open to this, and a lot of them also recognize the benefits of exercise. And they will even tell their clients, you should go exercise. But we all know that just because you tell someone they should go exercise, I don't know what the statistics are, but most of them don't do that.
Yes.
And so they are very encouraged to have a resource to refer their clients to bridge that gap that they're seeing too. And so again, just getting out in the community, finding those people and making those connections, those relationships, I'm finding it to be invaluable for so many people involved. So
yeah, this entire conversation has been around the concept of relationships.
yes, which I didn't know this is where we were going to end up, but
it's the beauty of an open-ended podcast. Melissa Merkle, thank you so much for joining us on the Wellness Paradox.
Thank you. It has been such a pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Melissa as much as I did. If you found it insightful and informative, please share with your friends and colleagues. Those shares make a big difference for us. Any information we'd like to share with you from today's episode can be found on the show notes page. That's by going to wellnessparadoxpod.com/episode 120. Please be on the lookout for our next episode when it drops in 2 weeks. And don't forget to subscribe through your favorite podcast platform. Until we chat again next, please be well